record on this computer. Ugh, I hate that voice. It's so weird. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming along to our Gardens for Wildlife pilot program info session. So some quick things, well, not quick this, but firstly, I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people as the traditional owners and true sovereigns of the land, now known as Yarra. I'm not sure what land you're on, but I live, work and play on the Wurundjeri land. We also acknowledge the significant contributions made by other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to life in Yarra, and pay our respects to elders from all nations, past, present and future. Just really quickly, what we're going to run through today, go through some housekeeping, what Gardens for Wildlife is, elements of a wildlife garden, which Anne is going to talk about, and also her experience as a volunteer garden guide. I'm going to have a bit of a chat, a more local context to Yarra, and then talk about how you can get involved in the program. So it should go for about an hour, and we'll have time for questions at the end. The housekeeping stuff, which I'm sure you've all joined Zoom sessions before, so you know this. I have hit record. I had to remind myself. You can keep your audio on mute, otherwise I might mute you if we can just hear background noise. If you've got questions, please pop them all in the chat as usual. I'm going to send out a bunch of links after this in an email. So if there's anything that we've spoken about today that you're really interested in knowing about or looking at, then I'll pop it in a link. Just let me know. And lastly, for our Gardens for Wildlife program, I'm going to be developing a beautiful icon with a species from Yarra. And I'm going to send around a link later so everyone can vote for their favorite of the 5 species, which I'll talk about right at the end. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Anne and we'll get straight into it.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anne Makhijani, and I'm the co-founder and volunteer garden guide for the Whitehorse Gardens for Wildlife program. I'm also on the board of Gardens for Wildlife Victoria, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you. It's not moving.
No. Try to, oh.
I put my cursor, there we go, it's worked now. We had this problem the other day as well, so bear with me if we have tech problems. So why wildlife gardens? Biodiversity loss is one of the top 5 global threats, and gardens on private land of all shapes and sizes can help to address this loss by providing wildlife, both flora and fauna, with valuable habitat that acts as a link between remnant vegetations in reserves and elsewhere. And every garden counts. If you think about it, the bulk of the land is owned in private hands, while public land are managed for biodiversity and improvement of habitat. With the bulk of land owned in private hands, there's definitely a need for some improvement and biodiversity outcomes on that private land. And that's where Gardens for Wildlife comes in. So, oops, now it jumped down. So Gardens for Wildlife is a not-for-profit network supporting councils and community members to co-design programs to involve local residents, schools and businesses to garden for local wildlife. So unlike other council service-driven models, this is a model where the community actually gets involved as well and helps to not just design the program, but also deliver it. And that's the empowering element of it for the community, to sharing ideas and resources, educating, celebrating success, solving problems, and linking individual organizations and councils to help each other. Working to strengthen connections between residents, nature, community, and place, and thereby improving well-being. So in looking after nature, we have conducted, research has been conducted on the programs and some of the projects that we've been running, and it has been documented and proven that not only are there benefits for nature, but the residents also benefit from it. So the key messages of Gardens for Wildlife are that participants are encouraged to create stepping stones of habitat in their gardens to provide connections for wildlife, flora and fauna to and from bushland reserves. Participants receive a garden voucher, a garden visit from a volunteer. They're given advice on positive plant choices and the benefits of local wildlife gardening if environmental weeds are removed and indigenous plants are included instead. They, as I said earlier, they are supported with a voucher of free plants. The number of plants can vary from program to program. Usually it's 20 plants, but some programs that don't have a community nursery within their local government area might be providing less plants, but that's not important. It's important that people are given a head start so that, you know, it's okay, here are some plants, this is what you do with them and how you go about improving the habitat and the biodiversity in your garden. And the program lastly is celebrated with a letterbox sticker. So some programs have stickers, some have plaques, and some have both. So in Whitehorse, we now have both a sticker as well as a plaque, so that residents can put it onto whatever the surface is that best suits that. Gardens for Wildlife Network, this started around 2016. And this is an old map, but you can see that, you know, pretty much most of metropolitan Melbourne is involved in some way, shape or form. And now this is anyway an old map, so that has changed again. And more programs are involved. But also, it's not just metropolitan Melbourne, as you can see from this map, even regional Victoria, a lot of the shires and the areas in regional Victoria are also developing the program. So it's spreading far and wide across Victoria. And not only Victoria, actually, there are some programs now starting up interstate as well. So the message is really getting out. The Gardens for Wildlife program began in Knox in 2005. And it was a partnership between Knox City Council, the Knox Environment Society, which is the Indigenous plant nursery in Knox, and the community. So the reason was because Knox had less than 4% remnant bushland, significant proportions of which were in private ownership. Wildlife and wild places were disappearing from Knox, as they are right across the country, actually, not just Victoria. 41% of plant species were critically endangered in Knox, and 62 of the 181 critically endangered species were not present in bushland reserves managed for conservation. So if there was any hope to actually protect those species, then something had to be done on private land. Knox bushland reserves are important biodiversity hubs, but as with other bushland reserves across Australia, really, they're becoming increasingly isolated, as you can see in these two images. They're surrounded by housing and roads, and therefore it's very difficult for fauna to travel from one reserve to another. So this is where Gardens for Wildlife comes in. Now, this is an example of two reserves that are completely disconnected, but one of the residents on the street between these two is part of Gardens for Wildlife, and that makes the difference. So that the more we have of these kinds of stepping stones, the greater the corridor we can create then between these isolated remnant populations. So the research that was conducted in about 2017 shows that connections are not just important for the flora and fauna, but they're also important for us. So these are comments from some of the participants in that research. I was able to see chocolate lilies for the first time and noticed those other things. And then it was just kind of went from there. It became part of your blood. It makes you feel good about your neighborhood and the people around. It's not all bad, and the world's not bad. There's people that are doing positive things. And For me, there's the element of discovery, which is really true. And no matter how long you work in these areas, you'll keep finding new and wonderful things that you hadn't noticed before or that you didn't know about. So there's always that learning, and that's so enriching. We're a lot more in touch with what's living in our garden. Slowly, things around you that are living come into your life. And Craig and I were talking a little earlier about being visited by sulfur crested cockatoos. And, when you have wildlife coming in to visit, it's just so wonderful. And no matter, how often it happens or how infrequently it happens, it gives one a huge buzz. The Knox Gardens for Wildlife program was unprecedented success. They had 100 participants in the first year, even though they originally expected only about 6 or 7. So suddenly they had these 100 participants, and they had to, really get cracking to deliver the program to them. Early surveys showed over 80% participants had removed or were working to remove identified environmental weeds. Now, this is much more effective than any local law could be. Less than 10% of the participants were members of an environmental group or friends group prior to joining. So a lot of people who cared about the environment, but weren't really actively involved in volunteering or in any sort of environmental program, were then able to do that in their own gardens. So a large number of indigenous plants were put into the ground, the redemption of the free plant vouchers, plus the increased sales figures for the local indigenous nursery, which was KES. And I remember I was involved with our local indigenous nursery, one of our 2. We are really fortunate in Whitehorse to have 2 indigenous nurseries, community driven. But KES suddenly had this huge demand on their stocks, and they just didn't have the space to propagate and grow them. So they used to provide the seed. So we had a bit of a partnership with them, and they used to provide the seed to our nursery, Bungaluk, in Whitehorse, and Bungaluk used to grow them up, and then once they were ready for sale, we used to ship, hand them back to KES to sell them out. So it was remarkable, the interest from the community. They have 1,600 registrations, and they're still growing. People want to do something. Like I said before, so the 3 core areas of influence of Gardens for Wildlife. One, of course, is the biodiversity benefits. The second is the personal well-being. But thirdly, there's the community building as well, because once programs are established, there are often events that are held for the members of the group, as well as for the broader community. And so people are able to make contact with other like-minded people. And that's really valuable. It's in terms of community building. So how to garden for wildlife? So there you can see the sticker that I mentioned before. Weed out weeds and make positive plant choices. These are the 2 things that make a huge difference. So there are 20,000 introduced plants in Australia and 20,000 naturally occurring plants, Australian plants. And if you think about that, so we have brought in as many species of plants into the Australian landmass as there were originally occupying this entire landmass. So there is so much pressure on the indigenous plants and on, the native flora because of that. 5,000 species of plants in Victoria, and over 2,000 of the introduced species have developed into weeds. 70% of these were garden escapees, and 12 new exotic plant species are declared weeds each year. So again, this sort of brings into sharp focus what we do in our gardens has a huge impact on the natural world around us. And it can be both beneficial if we do wildlife gardening and if we're conscious of what we're planting in our gardens, but it can also be detrimental if we inadvertently put in those weedy plants, which then spread into bushland areas and cause problems. Elements of a wildlife garden. Now, these are the key elements that a wildlife garden, in an ideal situation would have. Not every garden has the ability to put in all, but as many as possible has to only help to improve the biodiversity outcomes. So a tall, mature tree, which is native to the area, or which is also called indigenous, a patch of natural mulch for beetles and worms and other invertebrates, a clump of dense shrubs where birds can shelter, nectar plants for honey eaters. And when we talk about nectar plants, we need to also be conscious of, not creating habitat for bully birds, but we'll talk about that later. A cat-safe bird bath, frog-friendly pond with unpolluted clean water, a warm sheltered corner for lizards, and daisies for butterflies and bees. So a tall, mature tree local to the area, that's so valuable. You just cannot underestimate the value of tall, mature trees. So retain, if space permits, and plant indigenous trees or large indigenous shrubs if there isn't, the possibility of enough space. So if you have a small space, can't afford to put a 30, 40 foot tall tree, well, in that case, a large shrub like a Basaria, and we'll talk about that later, can be a good replacement rather than putting in a tree that's introduced or even from further afield in Australia. So indigenous vegetation has the best outcomes from a biodiversity perspective. Hollows in large trees can be formed when they're much older, 80 to 100 years old. But those hollows, again, are very valuable habitat for fauna. We have a lot of fauna species that have evolved to utilize this resource in what was then pristine forests. And so they now, can't breed without a hollow. So that's an important resource that they need. Local Banksias, wattles, or eucalyptus are one-stop shops for wildlife. And as you can see in the pictures here, they can be grown in pots, or they can be grown in very small spaces. So that's, something to consider. A patch of mulch for beetles and worms, but not just beetles and worms, also other invertebrates. And there are several ground foraging birds that look for insects. And you've got a picture over here of this eastern rosella that's foraging on the ground as well. Though you often, they're not something that you regularly see on the ground, but they do come down for seeds. Mulch and low vegetation are habitat for more than beetles and worms. So we've got over here skinks and reptiles. A patch of dense shrubs where birds can shelter. So planting a prickly thicket of shrubs provides great protection for small birds against larger territorial birds and predators. And if the space is small and you can't fit prickly shrubs because you're going to be brushing past them, well, even planting of dense shrubs is good. I've been to one of our residents over here who had a tiny little courtyard garden, but all along the fence line was this dense hedge. And lo and behold, while we were talking, she was telling me about the eastern spinebill. And while we were talking, in came one. And, so even in tiny spaces, we can create habitat for the fauna, provided we give them what they need. So nectar plants for honey eaters. So include coria species, as flowers occur throughout the bush, allowing small native birds some safety as they feed. But also, grevilleas are very popular amongst gardeners, but they're not actually indigenous to all areas around metropolitan Melbourne. Like in Whitehorse, we don't have any indigenous grevillea species. And often the cultivars, they hold their flowers on the outside of the branches so that you get that, display and that wow factor. But that then makes it very unsafe for the little birds to try and feed there because they're totally exposed. And so it's important, if you don't have indigenous grevilleas in your area and you do want to plant them, try and plant some that are, not those cultivars. Plant more of the species that have their flowers throughout the plant, and also don't put them all in one area all along a fence line or something, because then that becomes a big nectar source, and then bully birds like noisy miners and even rainbow lorikeets will then think that that territory is worth protecting and worth, so they can get very aggressive and completely exclude small birds. So that's something to think about. If you want to scatter them around, plant smaller nectar sources throughout the garden. A cat-proof bird bath. So if you have cats that visit, definitely that's a must. You have to think about it being cat-proof, because otherwise when fauna come to drink water, they're going to get attacked by the cat. So provide bowls of water of different sizes and at different levels throughout the garden, safe from cats and other predators. And usually, like, if you can hang a water bowl from a tree branch or from something, even if you've got some sort of a pergola, you can hang it from there. That's valuable for the fauna to be, and they feel protected from cats. But if you don't really have cats visiting your garden, having water at different levels, because fauna occupies all levels of, the ecosystem, and therefore if you put them at different levels, the fauna that occupies that level can utilize that resource. Clean water can be a lifesaver, as we've seen numerous times during all the terrible bushfires we've had. A frog-friendly pond with unpolluted water is good for dragonflies, but not just dragonflies, a whole host of other invertebrates, as well as frogs and other wildlife. A warm sheltered corner for lizards. So because they're cold-blooded, they need somewhere to bask. So it needs to be a nice, sunny, safe basking spot for lizards. Logs can provide that. Also, a pile of rocks. So if you have rocks that are embedded into the soil, that's not so valuable, because there aren't any cracks that the lizards can sort of dash into when they feel threatened. So just a loose pile of rocks, or even a few rocks just in a loose pile where there are cracks and openings, is very valuable for skinks and lizards to be able to hide in when they feel under threat. But you also then need to plant some vegetation near the log or near where you've got your rocks, because they need that as well. Daisies for butterflies, but not just butterflies, bees as well. The daisy shape is very attractive to a lot of insects. Lots of pollinator insects find the daisy flower very, very attractive and very easy to visit and get pollen and nectar from. So there are a few species, of quite a few actually within our area. I'm not sure what your plant list is, but these are Brachyschoma multifida, and they're a good daisy plant for butterflies. If you want butterflies, welcome caterpillars too, because caterpillars are the larval stage of the butterfly, and if we want those beautiful butterflies flying around and visiting our garden, then we need to be able to give them habitat for their life cycle. And so while there might be a small amount of predation, if we recognize that those caterpillars are going to then form, morph into those beautiful butterflies, and accept that's useful. The garden needs to be chemical free as well, because insects really struggle when chemicals are used. So try and avoid using insecticides or any chemicals, and you really don't need to, especially if you're working with indigenous plants. Indigenous ground covers and grasses are habitat for butterflies and other beneficial insects. And actually, I need to, go back a bit, because I've been talking indigenous, and I really need to actually explain what I mean by that. So plants that evolved in the actual space where they are considered indigenous plants, or are called indigenous plants. Plants that come from other parts of Australia are native plants. So they come from WA, Queensland, even further afield in Victoria. Not everything is indigenous to a particular area. So you've got your indigenous plants, which are the true local plants. You've got your native plants, which come from the rest of Australia. And then you've got your introduced or exotic plants, which have been brought in from overseas. So ground covers and grasses are very valuable because, again, they provide habitat and food for butterflies and a whole host of other insects and invertebrates. Lizards, spiders, and many unseen species that are important too. And spiders are one of those species that often, people have a fear of. But if one can recognize that spiders are a critical component of an ecosystem, firstly, they're a predator, and they will often predate on some of the pest species that visit your garden. I've got at my place a few St. Andrews crossed. So the spider on the screen is a St. Andrews cross spider. And I have a few of them this year that I had set up their webs. And one of them in particular was really very successful at catching a whole lot of cabbage whites. So that spider was doing me a really big favor, because otherwise I would be having to deal with all of the cabbage white butterflies. How am I going for time, Steel?
You're just at time now, but you can keep going. My part's a little bit shorter.
Okay, I'll hurry along.
Maybe another like 5 minutes-ish.
No, I'll try and wrap up quicker. I just wanted to mention that spiders' webs are very useful, not just for the fact that the spider can catch its prey by them, but there are bird species that use those spiders' web to actually knit their nests together. So there's a good reason then to leave the spider's webs, and don't mind if it's a little untidy, because that's good for nature. Plant in layers and multiples of species. So fauna occupies every layer of the ecosystem, and therefore if we plant in layers, we're replicating that and providing food and shelter for all those animals that occupy those niches. Look at a garden through a Gardens for Wildlife lens. So this is for basically people who go as garden guides or as garden visitors, whatever name you all decide to use. While we don't tell and we don't ask any resident to do what we think, we basically are there to help them to achieve their biodiversity goals. But when we are looking at the garden, these are the good, better, best approach is basically the non-weedy introduced plants. Better is the non-weedy native plants, but best is the indigenous plants, which are your true native plants. And gardens of any size and in any style can be created using indigenous plants. You've got the city of Melbourne right near y'all, where they have a very successful program, and they have balcony gardens, and that can be done too. So don't let size be an impediment, garden size. Gardening for wildlife is simple. Local native plants attract local fauna, spiders, insects, and much more. Lizards, frogs, birds, all the animals. And then they in turn become the food source for another species of animal. And so the whole food chain continues. So the White Horse program began in 2017. And it's a partnership between the city of Whitehorse and our two indigenous nurseries, Green Link and Bungaluk, and the community. So far, we've done 300 visits. This is till the end of last year, so 22. And we've got about 20 active garden guides. But, keeping in mind that 3 out of those years have been, given up to the pandemic, we're pretty happy with the way things are happening. And there's the paddle-oat, which I love. Gardens for Wildlife, the volunteer experience. So what can you expect? Firstly, it's the biodiversity improvements. As a volunteer, you go to people's homes, you help them understand the importance of biodiversity and the needs of wildlife, and it works, and that's really energizing to know that you're making a difference. And people don't want to be an expert. And of course, experts can do all of those things and do it wonderfully. But people want to believe that and know that they can do it. And when you come in as an amateur as well, and as a volunteer, member of the community, just like everybody else, then again, people feel, yep, if, they can do it. So enjoy sharing other people's gardens. It's such a joy to go from garden, to garden, and each one is different. Each one is unique. Every resident, is wonderful to meet. And then we learn from every garden and gardener. And we've been doing it for a few years now, but every garden we visit and every gardener we meet, there's something that you learn and something new that you discover. So it helps to build confidence and a sense of empowerment. Understanding that you're making a difference has to do that. Friendship, because you meet like-minded people, and community, because you work together, even as garden guides, as we call our garden visitors. There's a team of us. So we basically work together to make the difference. And this is a little poster that we've put together. So being involved in wildlife gardening is good for you and good for nature. And Gardens for Wildlife, it's all about beginning. Plant some indigenous plants in your garden. And this is for people that are looking to join as, to register to have their gardens visited. Manage or remove environmental weeds. Join your Gardens for Wildlife program and build wildlife habitat for local flora and fauna. Or become a Gardens for Wildlife volunteer. Promote Gardens for Wildlife using your organization's networks and events. For more information, you can go to the Gardens for Wildlife Victoria website, and Steele will probably send it around to you.
Yeah.
And to use the words of C.S. Lewis, you can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the end. So
yeah,
thank you very much for inviting me and for your attention.
Oh, thank you so much, Anne. I personally always love hearing about the program itself and hearing the experience of someone who is a garden guide. And there were so many valuable points. And I feel like we should probably point out that usually you run like wildlife gardening sessions that go for a full hour. So really a lot of those things that you spoke about were just very high level, the basics of wildlife gardening. It was not exhaustive. It was sort of to give everyone a bit of a taste test of what wildlife gardening is.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we had to really have our skates on to get through it all, because I apologize if you feel bombarded with information, but there is a lot of information to share. So yeah.
I thought it was really good and very simple. So just to kind of bring it back a bit more to a local context, and I don't know if there was a question. Were there any questions in the chat, Craig, after that, or should we wait till the end?
Yeah, just one that I'm responding to now. So from Isabella, and it's I can type. I'm typing a response now.
All right.
So, yep.
Sounds good. Otherwise, we can also have a discussion about it at the end too. So yeah, just to bring it back to a bit more of a local context, the city, as Anne sort of mentioned, Gardens for Wildlife started at Knox. It's spread out to multiple other councils now. City of Darebin, just to name some of our neighbouring councils. Darebin, Banyule, Melbourne all have their own programs. 2023 will be the year that City of Yarra starts our program, which is very exciting, or our pilot year. It really is, as Anne mentioned, a partnership between the community, between council, and also our Indigenous nursery, which is the Victorian Indigenous Nursery Co-op up at Yarra Bend Park. Don't know if anyone's been there before. It is lovely. I went out there yesterday and had the best time buying some tube stock for my own little balcony courtyard garden. We're establishing the program this year, and the first sort of start of it is going to be getting our inaugural volunteer garden guides on board. So do hope some people here are a bit excited to maybe consider becoming a volunteer garden guide. But if you're more thinking that you just want to participate as a household and be visited by garden guides later, that's totally fine. And I guess I just wanted to touch on what a partnership or co-design looks like. And it's really about myself as the Gardens for Wildlife facilitator from council, working really closely with our garden guide volunteers to shape what the program looks like for Yarra, because, you know, we've got quite a specific dwelling type, household, area, as Anne mentioned, Indigenous plant list. So it's all about what we want to focus on, how we talk to our community, what sort of material we want to have, getting a nice plant list together or a gardening booklet together for our Yarra residents. Now, just again, to bring it back to a bit of a local context, I wanted to show this slide because often people, and I'm not sure if anyone here really will not know this, but there is such a huge amount of biodiversity in Yarra that some people might not ever see or notice unless you go out really looking. But these are just some of the species that we find. Most of these images are actually from iNaturalist. So they've been photographed in Yarra by local community or just people passing by. There is such an incredible variety of insects that I just am constantly, you know, my mind is blown every time I go onto iNaturalist and have a look, because there's just so much out there. But also we've got amazing bird life. A lot of you said that a few birds were your favorite animal, which I love. The mammals, of course, the reptiles, and then the amphibians. So really we want to build these gardens for wildlife for these guys, the amazing little creatures that we live with. And again, just to bring it back to a local context and kind of think about why we want to have gardens for wildlife. There are lots of threats. Again, you probably do know about some of these, but we live in an urban environment. There's things that put constant pressure on wildlife. Things like climate change specifically is a big sort of messy monster. And, you know, there's a range of threats that come from that, but the extreme weather events and heat waves specifically, I think, is a very big standout when we live in an urbanized environment. And being able to provide those areas of shade or water sources for wildlife to be able to move around and seek that when it is very warm or we're going through a heat wave, super important. And did also talk about the pest plants and animals. I guess the weeds, she said, most of them are garden escapees. And I think that Gardens for Wildlife will really provide a good opportunity to talk to the community about what a weed is. A lot of people wouldn't even realize that this lovely vine, which is actually not lovely at all, it's a moth plant, is a weed, because I see them around all the time. So that opportunity to talk to residents and people about what a weed is and what you could replace it, or what Indigenous plant you could replace it with, as well as being able to replace it with something that provides a really good food source for our native animals. And maybe also deters a few of the bully birds, I would say. I like that you call them bully birds, Anne. And lastly, again, just very high level, like this list is not exhaustive of threats to our wildlife in urban environments, but the loss of green space is a very big one. So being able to have those little pockets of green in gardens, whether it's a balcony or a courtyard, very important. Or being able to talk to people about their pets or, you know, dogs and cats. I have a cat myself, but he's a very happy house cat and doesn't leave the house unless it's to go into the courtyard. And Anne did talk about Gardens for Wildlife creating those little areas or corridors or stepping stones. And I just wanted to sort of bring it more into context for everyone who I'm assuming lives in Yarra, or you might live near Yarra, or work, play, whatever it is. But we do have a really great amount of green space, but there is a lot of opportunity for improvement. So there's about 13.5% of the total area of Yarra being public open space. So that could be a bushland reserve or a park. And a lot of these areas is where most of our wildlife persist. There is, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this orange dotted line is where we could create habitat corridors in Yarra to connect up all of our reserves, which is really great. But you know, these areas over in the corners, if we think about it in a larger context, being near City of Melbourne and their reserves, there's lots of opportunity to create stepping stones across the whole city. We also have a lot of conservation groups and restoration groups that are out looking after and planting trees on public land, which is really great. But again, when we think about it in our own backyards, in our own private space, there's just so much opportunity for creating those little stepping stones. And I found this really interesting, but 85% of Yarra's population actually live in medium and high density dwellings, which is a very large amount. So I think that that's really going to help shape what our program looks like. And Anne mentioned that City of Melbourne have their own Gardens for Wildlife program. And I think talking to some of their volunteers and their facilitator, it is amazing what can be done in small spaces. I myself have a courtyard, so I know, but I just wanted to sort of reiterate that small spaces can be wildlife gardens too. It doesn't need to be a big garden. And examples, obviously, from Whitehorse, people have a little bit more room. But these are some examples. The first image is of a rental where they've put in planter boxes with Indigenous plants to their area. I think they're in Dandenong. All the other images on the right-hand side are actually from a City of Melbourne balcony. I think it's 20 stories up. And he has done such a fantastic job of putting Indigenous species and some natives into plant pots. And he's actually started noticing a lot of insects come into his balcony. So the one of the dragonfly on the right-hand side was my favorite. That's what made me get in touch with him. And he sent across some great photos of just how much you can put in a small space. He's done a lot of trial and error, but it does work. So any space can be a wildlife garden. It could be a terrace, a balcony, a courtyard. So just to kind of finish off, I wanted to talk about how to get involved in the program. So we are looking for our inaugural volunteer garden guides, and I wanted to just touch on what that means. So our first lot of garden guides, I can send around the expression of interest later, but they will sort of form our working group and have a lot of input into how we develop the program, what materials we have, as I mentioned before, and most likely how we talk to the community in Yarra, depending on their dwelling type. You don't have to have any experience, just a love for nature, which I think everyone here has, because I know you've all got your favorite animal. A love of nature. If you love gardening, that's also great, but you don't need to know any of these things because we will definitely be providing training. And as Anne mentioned, we're constantly learning. I'll be learning alongside everyone as well, especially from Craig, who's an absolute, he's very good in biodiversity. So we get to learn from Craig. The expression of interest for the first lot of garden guides is due on the 14th of March. It's an online application, but if you need a Word document printed out, I can do that for you and send it across. We'll have very informal interviews, mostly by phone, but if you want to meet in person, I can also come out and meet. We'll be doing all our onboarding in April, and obviously there's a lot of holidays in April, so I'll make sure it works for everyone. Then we'll be going ahead and running some training sessions. So I myself have got ideas about what the training looks like, but if the volunteers would like specific training on certain things, then we can certainly organize that. So there'll be training sessions like a propagation workshop with Vink up at Yarra Bend Park, weed ID with our bushland contractor, habitat gardening principles with the lovely Gardens for Wildlife Victoria crew, and then also being able to run shadow assessments with other council areas. The City of Melbourne Gardens for Wildlife program have already said that they would be happy to run some shadow assessments. So that will give everyone a really good opportunity to learn from each other, but also, build up your confidence. And then lastly, the household visits. And if you're interested in participating as a household, that's the next slide. But they'll be looking to commence from July, August 2023, so middle of the year. If you want to get involved as a household, I'll send around a link where you can sort of register your interest, and I'll give you priority for when we do the formal registration process. As Anne mentioned, usually when you open up Gardens for Wildlife, you get an influx of people wanting to have their houses visited, which is great. But just to not put a big burden on the initial volunteers, we'll limit it to about 25 households and then see how we go. And if we have more time, open it up again. The garden guide will provide you with, obviously, the visit, which will be, the most valuable part of going out. You'll then receive a report of the discussion and the recommendations. Well, I guess it's recommendations, but I guess it's more guidance on what you could do in your space. A Vinc voucher for 20 Indigenous plants. And again, definitely go up there now. It's lovely. A mailbox sticker, which will feature the icon, which I'll send you around the voting page, and also a wildlife gardening booklet, which we'll be developing, which will definitely include that Indigenous plant list, as well as, lots of other information on basic wildlife gardening. Just very quickly, before we head to the questions, I'm so surprised we're on time because we started late, but I just wanted everyone to have a really quick think. After hearing all of that, and again, it was very high level, if you could put in the chat, or maybe just have a think about what's one aspect of wildlife gardening that you would love to learn as part of the program, or that you would love to know more about in Yarra. I'm really curious to hear what everyone would like to know. I'll give you a minute. And I can't see the chat, so, oh, there we go, worked. Oh, cool. All right. Does anyone want to say what they'd like to learn as part of the program? Can grow in shady garden. How bad is salvias? Isabella, good point. I also have a very shady garden. It's a good one.
Could I answer that?
You can.
Well, there again are lots of Indigenous plants that can cope with part shade, but right up to full shade. So once you'll create your booklet and have a look at or you could even go to Vinc, and I'm sure Vinc would have the Indigenous plants, Yarra's Indigenous plants. So you could go there and talk to the volunteers there, and they would be able to help you to choose a plant that's the right size, as well as that can cope with the conditions in your garden. So right from dry shade to moist shade, there are plants that can cope with all of those conditions, and from taller plants to smaller plants. There are plants that, again, fit all of those niches. So before you think about or consider an introduced plant, maybe to make a trip to Vinc and speak to the volunteers. They might be able to help you find a suitable plant.
Yeah. Isabella, I was up there yesterday and got some plants, and I asked the same question because my courtyard gets very, very shady. So they gave some really good recommendations. Does anyone else have anything that they'd really love to learn before I go to open it up for all questions? No, maybe. Okay. Keep having a think and feel free to pop it in the chat. I would love for any information to sort of inform what we pop into our wildlife gardening booklet and what training we provide. So that is the end. I just want to open it up for any questions. I'm curious to hear, is anyone keen to maybe participate as a volunteer garden guide or is interested in volunteering in the program? I'll stop sharing my screen too, because that might be a bit nicer. Is everyone still here? I can see Isabella, but not anyone else.
I'm here.
Hi. Hi, Tess.
Hi. I'm interested in being a volunteer.
Cool. Lovely. Was that quite helpful in getting a bit of an overview?
Yeah. What sort of time commitment would be involved with becoming a volunteer?
So we've popped it in for about 5 to 10 hours a month, because it could vary week to week and month to month even. But initially, I'd love people to volunteer like 1 to 2 hours a week when we're developing everything and we're getting our training sessions together. And when you run your garden visits, it's a 1 hour visit, and then you go back and you write up your report. How long does that usually take?
So to go a bit further back as well, what we do is we have a monthly meeting with all our garden guides, and we put forward the list of gardens that we want to hand out that. And so people take a garden if they have the time. So it's not like you have to commit to a certain amount of time every month or every week or anything. Like, if you're going to be traveling, well, you don't take any garden then, and you take that month off. But if you take a garden, or then usually the visit itself takes 1 hour. And if, again, we have 2 garden guides that go to the garden. So one is Garden Guide 1 and Garden Guide 2. So Garden Guide 1 is the lead guide, who will then contact the resident and set up the visit, because you need to find a time that works for everybody. And Garden Guide 2 comes along and is the second pair of eyes at the visit. And then the report is written up firstly by Garden Guide 1, and then Garden Guide 2 will put in whatever whatever their suggestions are. We sometimes have a third person visit, and they come as an observer or a shadow, and those are garden guides who are in training. So as we get new people joining the program, part of that training is that they go for these garden visits as an observer. And then when they feel comfortable to, progress to Garden Guide 2 and then Garden Guide 1, that happens. Now, for us, the reports, again, vary enormously from Garden Guide to Garden Guide. Some people can spend a lot of time writing the reports, but we already have the pro forma for the report. So nobody has to write the report from scratch. All you need to do is go into each different section and put in whatever is relevant to that particular property that you visited. And then again, because we have over here larger properties, and depending on the enthusiasm of the garden guide that have visited, a lot of detail can go into it, but it doesn't have to be. Also, we sort of, once you've done a few gardens, you more or less have a palette of plants that are appropriate for different conditions. So full sun, dry shade, moist areas, part shade, things like that. So then you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. You can go back to old plant lists that you have created or old reports for a similar sort of garden and take those plants and always tweak it. I never ever, just copy and paste the same plants into every report, because I really want biodiversity outcomes, and that's not going to happen if we keep planting the same plants. So you tweak it, but you put in as much or time as you wish to. Some of our guides do it much quicker. I can spend a lot of time because I love to think about the garden and what can be done and what plants can be put in and vary things around. So, but that's about the kind of commitment. Even with the trainings, initially, it takes time when you're setting up the program. But after that, it's really how much time you have and what you want to do.
Yeah. Thank you, Anne. That was some very good insight. I hope that helped. Isabel?
I think I've volunteered. I'm going to a meeting on March the 1st on a Wednesday night.
Yeah.
Okay, so
that's our meeting.
Okay, I'll be there then.
Lovely. You'll hear the same presentation, but it'll be in person.
Yeah.
Okay.
And from Irene. So Irene and I are both we're both volunteers as well. She's a volunteer with Knox and I'm the volunteer with Whitehorse. But she's been with this program. She's one of the creators of the program. So she's got a a wealth of knowledge about this program from the time it started.
Yeah. And Xiaoyi, Nick, and Shelley, any questions or thoughts, or you want to know anything specifically about wildlife gardening or volunteering? Maybe not.
Hi, I'm Jiayi, and I'm really interested in this program, and because I'm really love the plants, that's why I chose the major as landscape architecture.
Mm-hmm.
And from your presentation and my understanding, so we did a report. We will do a report for the residents to suggest the plant species. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. So you would go out to the house for a visit, have a very high level conversation about what their goals are. Do they want to just improve their wildlife garden? Do they want to attract more birds? Do they want to attract insects? And then, as Anne mentioned, there's a pro forma list. So you'd be able to kind of go through some specific points. It would all be laid out, but really have those nice conversations. And then after the visit, there would be, you would go and just write up it's not a very huge report. As Anne mentioned, some garden guides will put a lot of effort into their reports. Others might not put as many words on the email or paper, and then send that back to the residents so they can kind of get started. And that would be, yes, including the Indigenous plant list and what would work in their area.
Can I just hop in over there, Steele? So there are resources that Gardens for Wildlife Victoria have already developed and that are available to affiliates once your program affiliates. So there's a report that has, or a document that has already been created, which is a general document about wildlife gardening, and it goes right the way from soil all the way to, you know, various plants, weedy plants, things like that. But it's not site specific. Firstly, it's not specific for all the different local government areas across Victoria. So that's where each individual program comes into its own. And also there are lots of programs across the world where residents are given information and said, here's the information, go do it. Whereas the beauty of this program is that people are mentored, are guided. So people will come out to you and help you achieve your goals. And that personalization makes a huge difference to people's confidence. Because if you think about it, everybody is familiar with introduced plants because you've got commercial nurseries all over the place that have them. And some people might be even familiar with native plants because, again, commercial nurseries carry them, and there are the odd, native nursery as well. But indigenous plants, a lot of people don't really have any exposure to, because community nurseries and indigenous nurseries are often run by volunteers. They're open only a few days in the week, and their hours are short, and therefore accessibility is much more limited. And so for residents to be able to feel confident to make the right choices in terms of indigenous plants is difficult. And that's where the guides come in and really help by making suggestions. Then when the resident goes to the nursery, they can have a look at those plants and say, okay, I prefer this one. Like whenever I do a report, I never only give one option for each sort of grouping. I'll give a palette of at least four or five for each of the different layers. And then the resident can go and choose which ones they want to put in. So there's autonomy, but it's assisted autonomy.
Yeah. And another good point is, as we're sort of developing our materials specific to Yarra in those first few months before the visits start, it will be really good to go over that little checklist and think about what is specific to Yarra and what that might our households or those households need, and make it quite personalized. We've got a few minutes left, but you can always email me any questions. We do have the in-person session that Irene will be presenting at on Wednesday afternoon at North Fitzroy Library. I'd highly encourage you to volunteer, because I'd love to get a great group of volunteers initially. to get it off the ground. I'll also, this was recorded, so I can send out the recording, but if there's no other questions, I'll let everyone,
1 minute. I've got
Yeah.
one.
yeah.
I've got friends outside Yarra. Are they allowed to be volunteers or are they excluded?
No, so they can be volunteers. They just can't have their household assessed, which makes a lot of sense. Not assessed, visited. So yes, it is open for the Yarra community. That might be they live, work, play, visit Yarra.
Okay.
There are also other programs as well. So if they feel like Yarra is too far to travel, their council area might have their own program. I'll send around the list of all the other affiliated programs in case they're interested in volunteering a bit closer to home. But also if you want your friends to come and you want to do all the assessments together, that's great. Or sorry, not assessments, visits. Sorry, Anne.
That's okay. I just mentioned over here that we do have a lot of garden guides that live outside of a particular local government area that volunteer in that local government area for whatever reasons, like, you know, they may prefer to do so. And, you know, so I think garden guides volunteering, you know, who live outside of your local government area is not a problem at all. As Steele mentioned, obviously, they can't get a garden visit, unfortunately, because they live outside of your city limits. But certainly they can volunteer and they're welcome. We have people who volunteer with the city of Melbourne and the city of Whitehorse, and we're, you know, miles apart. But they live in one, they work or study in one, and they volunteer in both, which is just wonderful. So we're very happy to welcome anyone as a volunteer.
Yeah, definitely. That was a good question. Any others before we head off? Thank you again for coming, and thank you so much, Anne, for presenting and coming along today from Whitehorse and taking time out of your morning. And thanks, Craig, for monitoring the chat. All right, I'm going to stop recording.